morning, everyone from Europe end, and good afternoon, everyone from the Indian end. We are glad to have here in our summer school Professor Shriram Venkatraman, that is from the Indraprastha Institute of Information Technology of Delhi. Shriram is an adjunct professor of anthropology and information technology at New Delhi IITD. And it's in an adjunct faculty at the Indian Institute of Management, Colvioki, IIMK. Other than several peer-reviewed journal papers, he is also the author of a monograph titled Social Media in South India, UCL Press, and co-author of a comparative book, How the World Changed Social Media, also UCL Press. He has taught several courses on digital and economic anthropology and digital research method, both at IIT Delhi and at IMK. He also taught a MOOC course on anthropology of social media on FutureLearn. He has a PhD in digital social anthropology from the University College of London, and he is also trained as a professional statistician and has held leadership position at Walmart, USA. So, Shriram, we are delighted having you here with us, and I just have to say, floor is yours. We couldn't wait to hear your presentation. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate this. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. And it's nice to see people across from, I guess, from India and Italy as well. The topic that I have for the day is actually called participatory mobility mapping. And the way that I'm going to be dealing with this is it's actually going to be, because we just have an hour's time. So if at all we had a lab session or something, we could have actually gotten into actually doing this hands-on. But then given that we only have an hour's time, so what we're going to be doing is at a very top level, we're going to be looking at how participatory mapping of mobility platforms can actually help understand how people view an urban area, or let's say a city, or any kind of space in their own terms. And very specifically, given that we're also going to be looking at it much more from an ethnographic perspective, the idea is very specifically qualitative idea of mapping the city. What is also going to happen is we're also going to be speaking about multiple social realities that actually come in when people actually do this kind of a mapping, and how they actually view the city, and how this could actually be arranged and rearranged as urban spaces, and how public policy could also be let's say public policy, or even if you're into typically hardcore business, or let's say into marketing, or for that matter if you're typically let's say a sociologist and anthropologist too, you could actually understand a lot more from how people actually view cities and how do they actually mediate and negotiate the city spaces on an everyday basis. And for us to do this, again, the basis of all of these things actually coming from different disciplines, typically from anthropology and sociology, and also from development studies, which has actually been doing social mapping for a very, very long time right now. And the other aspect that also comes in as GIS, which actually has a basis from cartography. Cartography, as you pretty much know, is a technique that's actually been used for a very, very long time, because people, and let's say human beings, we have been inquisitive in order to understand how the world around us actually looks like, how the world around us works, and how do we actually negotiate the world. This has been if you actually read The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber, it also seems like it's actually been going on for several thousands of years, and in different parts of the world, in different forms, people might have actually used line diagrams and everything else to actually represent their own space, or let's say their own space is actually represented through animals and other different kinds of symbols, and the kind of resources that's actually available. Social resource mapping already happened at that point of time, but then it was actually through different means and processes when you actually look at the cave diagrams and everything else. So definitely do read the book. It's actually called The Dawn of Everything. It's an amazing book. It's actually by an anthropologist as well as a human geographer. I think he's an archaeologist, David Graeber, and I think it's David someone else, and so but definitely go ahead and read the book. And more importantly, cartography is a technique which actually developed, and it's much more complicated right now as a technique. But then also do remember that, when the European trade and everything else started happening, the global trade started coming into force. The idea that trading relationships could actually be the ship trades and the ship routes and, plane routes and everything else were also coming into play, right? Like, the people could actually map out, like, this is the way that you'll have to take your ship, and this is how you actually reach India. Or if you actually take a wrong turn from Spain, you could actually end up reaching the US, and you actually find them out to be Indians, right? Like, so trade routes and ship routes and economic routes, and more specifically, when you actually read through the Silk Road trading and everything else, we'll actually end up seeing that there were very clear mapping, or let's say mobility mapping, that was already in vogue. It's not something new. It's actually been in vogue for a very, very, very long time. But then most of these things were anecdotal, or like, someone travels and then they come back, someone else takes the same route, and these were anecdotal. But then more importantly, right now, it's actually become much more with the technological advances, for example, like the GIS or other kinds of quantitative, or let's say satellite mapping, and the location data, trace data mapping, the GPS and everything else. It's actually become much more complicated. And there's always a dynamic mapping system that actually comes into play, where human mobility could actually be traced every single minute, or not every single second, but then every single minute, right? Like, so you can actually do this in different forms. But here, what we are going to be doing is we're actually going to be looking at participatory co-construction of mobility maps. It's not about someone else standing out there and then they're trying to map you, but then we're actually going to be looking at how we could actually end up doing this kind of mapping, the mobility mapping and everything else, much more from the participants' viewpoint as well. Like, how do the participants actually start looking at things? And again, when I say participants, because this is actually using ethnographic data, and if you're actually going to be looking at qualitative ways of framing this, so you will have participants, you'll have informants. And so what needs to be done is, like, we'll have to end up co-constructing maps. Now, co-construction of maps, in that sense, it's again not very new. Development specialists have actually been using. Social resource mapping has always been co-constructed for a very, very, very long time. So it's nothing new, right? Like, so however, what we're doing is, like I said, we're actually going to use the same techniques. We're combining techniques from 2 or 3 different fields. We are all putting it together, and we're going to be using that on platform-based, economies, or let's say like on Uber and Ola. Very specifically, since they're mobility-driven. And Raj is also here. Like, since we have actually been collaborating on something which is very specific to the food vertical. Again, Raj is actually looking at food vertical, for example, like Zomato and Swiggy as well. So there are different kinds of mobility maps that you can actually draw from each of these platforms. And when you actually combine all of them together, it actually becomes a very interesting case study to understand how do these people actually end up looking at a city. And from the way that they end up looking at a city, can we actually come to conclusions about, like, instance, are there very specific social trends that actually pop up? And are there any conclusions, or can you derive conclusions that actually help public policymakers in a much better way? Or if you're just going to be an anthropologist, it also tells you what makes us human. And if there are certain kinds of, let's say, class issues and everything else that gets reiterated over and over again. We'll look at one of these examples as we go on. But again, as I told you, this can it has to be done longitudinally, given that ethnography is longitudinal. But then we're not speaking about like very quick run ethnographies where you just get in, get out. We're not speaking about that. And we're also not speaking about diachronic qualitative spatial maps, right? Because people actually mistake longitudinal with diachronic. Diachronic actually means at 2 different points of time, and synchronic is just at 1 single point of time. But then we're actually using a longitudinal mechanism where we're actually collecting data over a period of time. It's not like one time, go to the field right now, go to the field after 5 years, see the changes, and then you don't write about that. You're actually collecting data on every single day basis, because this is actually digital data. You can actually do it through digital ethnographic methods as well. But more importantly, how do you actually it's again a lot of these things, because it's actually a visual data technique as well. A lot of these things can actually take very interesting shapes and forms once you start looking at it much more creatively and very strategically, and to actually end up answering your research question that you might actually have. And by the way, like in sense, so we'll actually get to that in a second. But then you don't necessarily need to have. Sometimes some of these things actually happen on an organic basis. It's not about like you have a very specific research question, you get in, and then you get out with this data. The ethnography is a very organic process. It's not about, you have a typical larger research question, but then once you enter into the field, there are other variables that actually come into play. You have a much better idea of what's actually happening out in the field only once you get into the field, you dip yourself into the actual realities the field actually poses for you. Again, this is just an ongoing study. So what you might end up seeing is like in sense, not the actual maps, but then like in sense, I'm just going to tell you about how did we actually go about doing this, right? So it's still an ongoing study. So there are maps that we might actually end up doing, and then that has to be sent to publication. So not everything can be exposed out here. But then remember, there's so much that you can actually do when you actually combine techniques and technologies from different aspects. What is the study? So this study started off in 2017 when I was in New Delhi. So I started looking at Ola and Uber drivers. More specifically, I was actually trying to explore and understand, for the first time in India, the rating system, typically it's actually used where it's always, right? Like in sense, so always in India, the customer is the one who actually gives a rating to the service provider, right? And the service provider knows the kind of rating that you've actually given to them. And of course, there are organizations, and then there are multinational companies which also have a customer lifecycle value and everything else that they end up doing on you with the big data analytics and everything else coming in. They pretty much understand the kind of lifecycle value that you might actually offer, and the kind of behavior. It also comes with respect to the kind of economic behavior that you actually end up showcasing within each of these, let's say, economic or let's say multinational companies. But then Uber and Ola, for the first time, they actually introduced something called like instance where the drivers could actually rate the customers, and the customers could actually see what their ratings were. This was not just based on economic behavior of the customers alone or understanding the customer lifecycle value, but it was also based on the social behavior of the customer within the actual car. This was almost like shocking for the customers when you actually went to the customers and asked them, because it was actually a class kind of a issue, right? For example, nowhere, I'm admitting people, just to let you know, like I think I just admitted Laura too. Sorry. Yeah. So the customers were never, like in sense, it was actually a class issue as well. Like in sense, someone lower to me was actually, rating me, and this time I had to go in, and then like in sense, I could see what they were actually rating me as, and so it was almost like in sense, it was onto the face and everything else, and so it was a fascinating thing that was actually happening for the first time. And more interestingly, so when I started looking at this, it was much more like from a government micro-sociological perspective to understand and see if at all the getting into the car and ordering the car and then getting into the car and then driving somewhere and then letting them go and everything else. And so what really happens between the rider and the driver at this point of time, where they could actually collude on the ratings as well as they could actually conflict on the ratings, and the kind of behavioral structures that were being forced by Uber and Ola onto the rider as well. Like you might have actually seen sometimes, if you're actually from India, or let's say from all around the world, you might have actually seen that people can actually, Uber drivers, and of course, Ola is not out there. Ola is something very, very similar to Uber, but it's actually operating in India. But then both of them could actually give you, ratings. So I was actually looking at it much more from a performative aspect and everything else. But then when we were actually looking at it, there was something organically that was developing out of this. And the organic development was like, there were people, there were drivers as well as riders, where the drivers could actually hijack these riders, and then they could actually take them off to a separate, they could actually offer them services separately as well. Not just on the platform, just outside the platform as well. And these were done through social media channels, very specifically WhatsApp, Telegram, etc., etc. But more specifically in 2017, it was much more to do with WhatsApp and Facebook rather than Telegram. But then, like since WhatsApp and all these kinds of things actually came into play. Now, during COVID-19 lockdown, and then I had research partners like Gillette, as well as like instance Raj, who actually came in, and then like we were looking at very specifically when the government, or let's say Ola and Uber, actually shut down their services in 2019, let's say 2020 during the COVID lockdown. How are these people managing, to survive in this kind of an economy, very precarious economy? How did these people manage to survive? And that is when we started looking at WhatsApp networks and the other kind of social media networks that existed outside these platform ecosystems, and how these actually bundled up to actually become one single platform, one single network or platform, where they could actually share data across platforms, they could actually share data across groups within the same platform and everything else. That's typically a different study that we're actually looking at. But then I'm just trying to tell you, like, what is the basis, what are the theoretical basis and the assumption that we're actually making in order for us to do this kind of a let's say participatory mobility mapping, right? Now, when we actually typically view them as like, how are these people surviving in the precarious socioeconomic reality? There's something else also that we might want to consider. Like, they were actually being seen by the platforms itself as complementers, right? They were seen as platform partners, and they were not seen as employees. It was not like typically they were, because when you actually start looking at them as employees, there is a certain kind of an agentic boundary that actually gets drawn around them. They would not be able to, mapping their mobility becomes extremely difficult, because at some point of time, you'll have to get to Uber and Ola and then ask them, like, where did you, or let's say, like, if you're friends with them, they could actually tell you where they actually went. But then typically the hardcore data and everything else that you actually end up getting from them could actually become much more, it has to come from Uber and Ola. But more importantly, what also happens is, because they actually look at themselves as entrepreneurs of sorts, or let's say micro entrepreneurs of sorts, what actually becomes interesting is they have this kind of an agentic freedom where they could actually decide that they want to go to one place, they don't want to go to another place, where would they go at certain times of the day, where they wouldn't go at certain times of the day, and everything else, where they could actually hop on. They are multi-homing, right? Like, so they can't be looked at as employees. They're multi-home on both Ola as well as an Uber, or I'm very specifically speaking about Ola and Uber. I'm not speaking about Zomato and Swiggy, but then, like, they'll actually take one or two examples from there. But Ola and Uber, like, they were very clear, like I said, they were multi-homing on both these platforms, and they actually knew, and on their own social media bundle as well, on their own networks on social media, so they could actually jump onto whatever network could actually give them that kind of an agentic freedom to go to different places within the city and mediate the city as per their own wants and needs at different times of the day, and based on whatever they knew through the knowledge networks that actually existed or came through these unofficial, non-platform oriented services or networks like WhatsApp, Telegram, etc., etc. Now, this is the basis. We'll have to take this as the basis for us to even do this kind of participatory mobility mapping, so it actually becomes much more effective. Okay, so yeah. So how can this be done, right? Like, so there are multiple ways that you can actually do a participatory mobility mapping. There are several different ways. You can actually do it very, very quantitatively, and you actually have a typical statistical data analysis techniques, which actually combine quantitative ways of analyzing, mobility mapping. It's actually called spatial data. Larger term for this would be spatial data analysis. There are you could actually do multi-dimensional scaling, as well as, like, instance, that is typically, that's not a spatial data analysis, but then you can actually do cluster analysis, and with respect to several different spatial features, and then you can actually do a typical quantitative analysis. But then we're not going to be doing that. Because we actually took an ethnographic framework, way of data collection. So we'll actually, typically, ethnography is actually seen as either being a mixed methods kind of a thing, or a typically qualitative way of understanding the world and how you actually end up collecting the data. So we'll be using qualitative mechanisms in order for us to do this. There are also mixed methods where you can actually combine. And sometimes for us, again, like, if you're actually going to be using survey data, you could actually call yourself as a mixed methods kind of a thing. But then, like, so what is your major methodology that you actually end up using becomes a kind of a, let's say, a kind of let's say, kind of an organizing technique in how you actually end up collecting this data, right? So, so even though we end up using mixed methods, sometimes, or let's say, because the larger arcing idea would actually be much more qualitative. So from a qualitative perspective, we also end up looking at the mixed methods kind of data collection and everything else. Now, there are other ways that you can actually collect this kind of a data, because you could actually use location data, GPS data. You could actually there are lots of apps which actually help you collect trace data, and you could actually form your own app in where you actually end up collecting. There are lots of people who actually end up doing that through collecting GPS data on an everyday basis, or a location data, or for that matter, like, I use a trace data app called as Paco, which is actually created by employees of Google. So, and that's a very interesting app. But again, like, you'll have to teach, if you're going to be using these kinds of data collection mechanisms, you'll have to teach your participants on how you can actually collect this data, because otherwise it's not going to be pretty easy for you to do this. We end up using ethnography, which is typically long-term and typically an ethic approach, where we don't necessarily, again, a participation, again, would actually mean a participation as a rider, but not as a driver. And we also look at, like, let's say, a large collection of digital and material artifacts, which would include data forms of several different kinds, and of course, material forms of several different kinds. For example, it could actually be audio data, spatial data. Let's say, like, when I say spatial data, it could actually be map sharing and everything else that actually actually happens, visual photographs, videos, or even text data. And text data could actually be both in local languages as well as in English. It could actually be in, it could just be one word or multiple words and everything else. More importantly, we'll have to also remember there are several socio-technical realities that actually come into play, where it does not necessarily mean that you actually once you actually get into the data collection phase, you would actually end up collecting every single form of data that's actually available out there, because these are people typically from the lower middle class or lower socioeconomic class who actually act as drivers. So there is a power, there's a power technical, there's a power centricity that also comes into play there. But more importantly, it has to be trust-based, and this trust also has to understand and undertake, let's say, like I said, it has to capture the social technical reality. For example, let's say someone only knows how to operate on Telegram, they would not know how to use WhatsApp. You'll have to take that into consideration. The material affordances, or let's say the app-based affordances, also have to be taken into consideration. Some people suddenly they might actually have one smartphone. The smartphone is actually used by their children for online classes, and then they start operating on let's say, like, instance, a typical Nokia phone or something like that, which is like a typical feature phone. So that also has to be taken into account. And the data plan might actually get over. They might send you data over. Let's say they might actually start sending you SMS text, or they might actually call you to tell you what really happens. So these are different kinds of field realities that needs to be taken into account, and their own idea and understanding of how certain things work and certain things don't work should also be understood and taken into account as well. Now, typically, this would actually mean a digital ethnographic approach, but then digital ethnography here does not mean only digital. It also means that you'll have to also collect offline data on these platforms as well. On where do they go, how can you actually map their mobility and everything else. So, but then typically, it's actually a digital ethnographic approach. So as just a very quick reminder, ethnography, the reason, again, this is again a very epistemic source of data collection. So you'll have to remember the reason that they're collecting typically in ethnographic data would also mean because there are multiple realities. It's a first-hand data collection process. There are multiple realities and social realities, and these realities could actually be based on individual or the group. So we'll have to take into perspective their experiences, their stories, and their anecdotes from every day as well, to understand how things work for them within the city. This does not mean that we're only collecting digital data and there's absolutely no participant observation. So you'll have to write with them. You'll have to do in-depth interviews with them, because once you actually map the process and everything else, you'll have to take the map back to them and then ask them, interview them, understand is that whatever you're mapped and whatever they end up seeing, is that right or not, and everything else. And this has to be an ongoing process. You can't do this just on a one-time basis and then understand or assume that this is how they actually react on an everyday basis. And of course, you'll have to collect a lot of material artifacts, records, let's say, and this is where your actual, let's say, data collation and data organization technique comes into play. Now, social mapping. Just to offer you a perspective of what social mapping is, social mapping has been, it's a process that's been used for a very long time. It's a visual technique. It's a visual spatial technique that's actually been used by anthropologists and very specifically rural sociologists too, right? So they actually get into an area, they actually take the area, they ask people. Again, this is a participatory mechanism. It's not social mapping from my perspective, and this is what I think it is. It's actually a typical participatory mechanism where they sit down in front of a village. They actually have groups, focus groups, and everything else. And then some of these focus groups are not typically your advertisement focus groups with 12 people. Sometimes this could actually become larger groups, around 30, 100 people too, like in the entire village might be around you. And again, it could also be class-based. It could actually be caste-based if at all you're actually working from India. And let's say, and then you actually sit down and then you actually end up mapping. There's actually there's a lot of data. There's a lot of work on social mapping from Africa as well as from other countries as well. Very specifically, these are rural studies that have actually happened. So, and then the anthropologists or rural sociologists will sit down and then start mapping the entire village. And then they would actually end up, this was typically done to understand resources that existed in different parts of the village and who could actually access what resources at different times of the day. So time is always a variable to be controlled. Even though we're actually looking at space, just remember at the back of your minds that time is always a variable that needs to be controlled. Controlled not in terms of the quantitative control that I'm speaking about, but then in terms of qualitative ideas. Like I said, how do you, at different times of the day, time is almost like a text that needs to be read, right? Like, so different times of the day, who uses what, why do they use this, and then you'll have to understand, like, how does time play a bigger role in the spatial mapping as well. So it's actually typically a spatio-temporal mapping, even though it actually seems very static. But then to order and map time, people end up using different hues and colors and everything else. But then that's something that I don't think we'll be able to cover into how different hues and colors are used. It's also a very creative process, but then there's so much of material available. If you actually go to C Maps, and so, which actually does social mapping, and or let's say OpenStreetMaps or Google Maps or Google Maps community as well, like they'll actually tell you how to do this. The larger mapping, this one, you could also get into ArcGIS, which is, I think you'll have to pay for it. The other ones are the Google Map and the OpenStreetMaps are free. The other one is like ArcGIS, you'll have to pay for it, but then that's a much more, let's say, complicated or much more sophisticated data, let's say, cartography technique that you can actually use on ArcGIS. But more importantly, when you actually end up doing this social resource mapping, you understand different parts of a space, how different spaces are actually ended up, how different spaces within us, whatever you want to study, how different spaces are, micro spaces are ending up being used within a larger space that you're actually trying to study. So these were typically hand-drawn maps. Development specialists use a lot of hand-drawn maps, but I think right now, from one perspective, now social mapping has also started taking the shape of, with the GIS and OpenStreetMaps and everything else coming into play, social resource mapping has also started taking a different shape and form right now. And then the only thing that needs to be remembered is social mapping does not necessarily mean that we're only going to be using a very micro space to actually do this, or a meso space. Mapping is always, social mapping has always happened on macro maps as well. For example, there have been studies which actually do, I think the study was published in Nature or Science, where there were two economists who actually tried and found out what were the poverty levels of different places, let's say, of different spaces within Africa, based on the light emanating from these regions at different times of the day, or let's say much more specifically the evenings, right? So they actually use satellite images in order for them to, it's a typical computational social sciences problem. By the way, like I said, if you want to, that's another area, I'll get to that in a second. There's so much of resources in computational social sciences, but if you understand those techniques as well, you could actually do social mapping with those techniques as well. It's actually by, I think Chris Bale might have actually been in one of your, this one. So he actually runs that. I think he's one of the core members of this group. It's actually called the Summer Institute of Computational Social Sciences, SICSS. They have a lot of videos on how to do some of these things as well. So you might want to, if you're interested in mapping and everything else, you might want to go there and then see those videos as well. But then macro maps have always taken place. For example, international migration, everything else is something that people have actually been looking into in a very lot more detail. So, and the meso maps would actually become urban area traffic clusters and everything else. And micro, for example, like I think it was Heather Host who actually did something on, in-house spatial mapping on, let's say, like, instance, how do children use digital artifacts within their homes, right? Like, where are these digital artifacts placed within homes, and where can you actually go to get these digital artifacts together and everything else? So there's been a lot of studies on, it's actually been a part of a larger ethnographic study, or let's say a larger sociological study, or larger development area, or let's say development studies or urban study, but it's not been, there's not been much of this one coming out very specifically on qualitative mapping technique and everything else. But there might be, so you might want to, I think the journal called Field Methods might actually have a bit of data, let's say papers on this as well. Social mapping, again, just remember this actually arises from a technique called as cartography. This is cartography has been a technique with technological improvements and everything else. You can actually do multidimensional feature mapping and everything else on cartography. Traditional mapping is always it still finds a place, but then more importantly, like for example, the school atlas and everything else devised from traditional mapping. But then more importantly, mapping with GIS is actually something that a lot of people have started doing right now. Urban studies, geographers, human geographers also end up doing a lot of mapping with GIS tools and techniques. Again, ArcGIS is another thing that you might want to use if at all you want to use complicated data mapping techniques. But there's something called static mapping versus dynamic mapping that you might want to keep in mind. Static mapping is what we actually end up doing because these are not, we can't do dynamic mapping unless otherwise you actually have, let's say, satellite imagery and everything else. And what Google does with respect to traffic clusters with with GPS as well as with satellite imagery and everything else is typically a dynamic mapping. It's not typically satellite it's not typically static mapping. Of course, there are parts of Google Maps which are static. The areas don't change. But then, like in the movement of people, the movement of vehicles and everything else could actually have a dynamic mapping. So any map could actually be seen as static, dynamic, or a combination of dynamic and static. Social mapping, again, ethnographers have actually used this for a very long period of time. As I told you, social resources could also be mapped with thematic maps, where you could actually have different indices to actually map different, let's say there's a water body, and you want to see how different classes of people within the same village or within a certain space actually go ahead and then start using those water bodies. What you could actually end up doing is, you could actually start taking an indices of this is the level of water that's actually being used by this kind of this class at this time of the day and everything else. And so in order for you to actually visually represent that, you could actually show that by choropleth, with thematic maps and everything else. And you could actually have, you could actually combine several of these individual maps together, and you could always have a community participatory techniques, and you could actually have a larger stack of maps which are layered one after the other as well. So there are different, and then when you actually start layering them, you could actually see that the way that you're actually looking at the town or city might be very different from the way that the humans who actually have been populating that town or a city or the village might actually be looking at their own spaces. So the way that you look at it versus the way that a satellite image looks at it versus the way that the humans who actually populate that space might look at it might be very different. For example, this is something that you might want to remember. There might be let's say if you're from a typical upper middle class or something like that, the chances that you might actually, a slum might actually be ending up being visible to your eyes, or the way that unless otherwise you actually make a move, let's say unless otherwise you have a mobility through that area, the chances of that being visible to your eyes on an everyday basis is actually very, very low. While there might be, gentrified upper middle class, let's say, multi-storied apartment complexes might be much more visible to you. The same way for the other person, like for example, let's say someone who's living in a favela or a slum, if you ask them, for them, the chances that they might actually end up getting into a gentrified apartment complex, and then the way that they end up using a middle class, a typically upper middle class apartment complex might actually become much more invisible for them compared to what is actually the spatial visibility that they actually have. The spatial visibility, again, is also because of ghettoization, gentrification, and all those kinds of aspects as well. So just remember, it's not just from one single dimension that we're viewing this, and any mapping technique also has to be viewed from multiple dimensions, typically like how ethnographers would actually view this if you're actually going to be using a qualitative technique. It takes time. So just to let you know, there's not something that you actually do in a day. It takes time for you to actually collect this kind of data and then do it. Now, when we actually speak about participatory static mapping or mobility data, we actually are speaking about a static mobility spatial data mapping, right? We're not speaking about dynamic things, even though we're actually looking at the mobility and everything else. But then remember, we can't do, when we speak about dynamism, dynamic mapping, we have to remember the kind of dynamic mapping that we're speaking about in today's world. We can't compete with Google to actually end up looking at the kind of dynamic mapping that they might actually end up looking at. Like in the traffic, we can't look at traffic data the same speed that Google actually starts, or let's say iMaps actually give you the traffic data. Right, so we are looking at typically static maps, but then because they actually developed over a period of time, you'd actually be able to look at the trends and how they actually form over a certain period of time. Now, the reason that you have to co-create this with a group under study is because only then you'll actually be able to look at trends. Otherwise, what actually can happen is these can actually become anecdotal maps, or the way that you actually look at them is how you're going to be representing them, not in the way that they actually end up looking at stuff. So it's completely whose viewpoint are you going to be looking at is much more important. So it's always good to create a map with their viewpoint as well, not just with your viewpoint only. Remember, again, this is again going back to the idea that these are entrepreneurs, because like in the mapping, if you actually map them outside these formal platforms, they are entrepreneurs. And that's one of the major reasons that they also exist outside the formal platforms on their own social media platforms and their own networks and everything else with their own network of customers. So if you're going to be mapping them, they are Uber and Ola drivers, but they also do other things as well, right? So typically, as an agent tech entrepreneur, you'll actually be mapping them. So you'll have to get their data in order to map how they actually mediate through a city at any given point of time. So why participatory? What can actually be, remember you as a researcher are like limited, and as an ethnographer are still much more limited, because if you don't understand quantitative techniques, you're much more limited. So, but then like you are, but you have a very important virtue called patience, which typically, like, with the big data and everything else, it's actually going to be very difficult getting that kind of a virtue. So qualitative ways of collecting data is as much important as quantitative ways of collecting data is. And but remember, more importantly, the reason that you'll have to be making this much more participatory is because of what we spoke about: data visibility versus data invisibility. For you, from your own, let's say, positionality in the field, what can actually happen is, like, what can actually be invisible to you is very much made visible on an everyday basis for these drivers, right? So remember, you'll have to have it much more participatory. Otherwise, you'll actually start putting the entire mapping system through only your perspective alone. And more importantly, just remember that your resources is also at play out here. So you'll have to be very careful about how much data that you collect. And again, remember, again, your time is also at play. And more importantly, there are unknown aspects of the city where you can't travel alone. You'll have to only go with, like, in sense, after any city, there are unknown nooks and corners and everything else where these drivers will actually have access to, but you might not. So there are multiple realities that actually comes in from their aspect. So, and remember, collecting it over a period of time actually reduces the data reporting bias and errors as well. I'm not speaking very specifically with respect to ethics and issues of privacy, because I'm sure, like, everyone understands how ethics and privacy out here work. Because if you're just going to be using a GPS data mechanism to collect data, I would want to recollect and let you know about something that actually, Uber did this. I don't know whether you remember, there was a study that Uber put up around 6 or 8 years ago, and then they took it down after there was a lot of public hue and cry, where Uber actually said, based on where you travel at different times of the day, and because based on their own idea of how the city could actually be mapped at that point of time, they could actually tell, why were you traveling to that certain location? Why was the customer traveling to that location at that particular point of time? For example, they actually gave an example of whether they could actually even tell the customer if the customer was actually visiting family, or if the customer was visiting escort, or if the customer was going in for some certain other reasons. So, and then what happened was, with the because the customers as well as the Uber riders at that point of time felt that it was actually much more of a, there was a large scale data, this was nothing but a large scale surveillance on why was someone visiting certain time, certain places at some point of time of the day. So what generally happened at that point of time was, like, because there was a large hue and cry about Uber's data surveillance and everything else, the study was taken down. So remember, when you actually do this kind of a qualitative way, you actually take the consent of the driver who's actually going to be giving you this data. So you'll have to ask them, when can I, and the driver also decides on what data to give you, what data not to give you as a participant, right? So if the driver decides, I'm not going to give this data to you, so be it. You don't want to collect the data because you don't want to be seen as being, and you should not be asking or pestering them for data on an every minute basis, right? Like, it actually becomes much more of a data surveillance issue. So leave it out to them, but then make them understand how important the study is for you. And so, or, typically, why would the study be important? And then then you actually pre-decide on the kind of data that you could actually go ahead and collect from them. And then they would actually choose on what data to give you, what data not to give you. And that's one of the major reasons that you'll have to do this on a longitudinal basis, on a long-term basis, because only then you'll start feeling and understanding trends of how this person actually travels within the city. And because once you understand how this person travels within the city, you'll have to collate all the participants' data, mobility data together to actually have an abstraction formed, and the mapping of layers and everything else comes in only then. And that is one of the major reasons you'll have to do it longitudinally to understand there's no, and remember, there should not be any data reporting bias or errors. And this is only done when you actually do it longitudinally. So the data that we actually, as I told you, like, we were looking at 4 different platforms in 2 different cities to start off from, but then, like, we extended it to 4 different cities right now. But then this presentation is only about Ola and Uber, much more specifically, and how it actually works out from Chennai. I'm just giving you examples from Ola and Uber, much more specifically from Chennai, right? Remember, again, given that you're actually situating these studies within the global south that has its own socio-technical realities, we've already spoken about the socio-technical reality at that a little earlier, so I'm not going to repeat it. Most importantly, the participants or informants, typically like any kind of ethnographic study, they'll have to trust you to give that kind of data to you. Otherwise, it can be a problem. Like instance, otherwise, the data that's reported to you might be completely false, or they might actually move out of the study at any given point of time. So remember to actually have trust and not to pitch one driver against another, to question about one driver's position within mobility data within other drivers. So you'll have to safeguard the data as well. This does not necessarily mean that we're only collecting data only by digital recording or trace data apps or whatever it is. But then more importantly, we could actually end up collecting data through multiple sources, typically like how an ethnography is actually done, through observation, multiple rounds of interviews, before the data is actually collected, after the data is collected, and during the data collection process as well. Like you could also use surveys, not just as a quantitative mechanism for collecting data, but then more importantly, surveys could also become much more like, because people understand surveys much more easily than they understand ethnography. Or when you actually tell them that they're actually trying to do an observation or multiple rounds of interviews, people might think it's a sheer waste of time. So when you actually give them surveys, it's a nice rapport building process that you actually start off with. And then through surveys, you actually start getting other forms of data with typical qualitative mechanisms as well. Now, data can actually come in, again, as I told you, from trace data app, and you could always ask them to send data from WhatsApp, Facebook, Telegram, general SMS data, etc. Like in sense, so they might actually end up doing data forms. There are multiple data forms out here, so they might actually start adding you to their WhatsApp groups. They're larger WhatsApp groups, so a driver might exist in several different WhatsApp groups at the same time. These WhatsApp groups are also made of typically other drivers, or everyone is an Uber driver, or everyone is a driver in those groups. And there are multiple groups that they might actually be members of. And one larger group might actually have, let's say, 5 subgroups, because there are only around, let's say, one large group of around 1,000 people, 1,000 drivers might actually be divided into, let's say, 4 or 5 larger groups with around 200 to 250 members in each group, right? So this could actually happen as well. Now, the most important thing is, once you actually collect this data, you'll have to assemble the data, and then that is where you might definitely need the help of a qualitative software like NVivo or MaxQDA or QDA Miner or whatever it is. So it's always good to learn one of these software as well, because otherwise it's a lot of data. And the problem is arranging them and then thematically coding them and everything else becomes a lot, typically difficult. So learning different coding schemes would actually help. And you could actually segregate the theme of location data, everything with respect to location separately, and then you start putting them onto maps. More importantly, these maps could actually be formed on a monthly basis. And then, like instance, you could actually use, again, as I told you, OpenCity Maps, Google Maps, are just whatever it is. But more importantly, OpenCity Maps is a very interesting platform where it actually uses collaborative processes where people might have already mapped social resources in a specific area at specific points of time. And what could actually happen is you could actually compare the data that you're mapping with this already mapped sources and everything else as well. So it could actually you could actually correlate your data with the social resource that's already been mapped onto that area by other collaborative map makers all around the world as well. So now there are different data forms. Again, as I told you, I just have another 3 slides. I'll just go very, very quickly. So different kinds of data forms. Again, oral mobility data. This could actually be in terms of where people could actually send you WhatsApp voice messages. It could actually be sent between the drivers. It could actually be sent to you. It's always good to take these, the data that you actually get. Remember, it's always multimodal. It's not just one single mode alone. So it could actually be in forms of oral mobility data, or you could actually, whenever you call them up as an interview process, they might actually end up telling you where are they moving at that point of time during the day. Even trace data apps could also do that for you, or when you're interviewing, they would actually tell you the entire schema, or let's say schematic mapping, where they're actually moving at different parts of the day and everything else. Textual data could actually be, again, between you and the driver, or between the drivers. If you're actually in a WhatsApp group or a Telegram group, you would actually end up seeing, like, instance, again, you could also use a trace data app to collect this kind of data as well. But remember, when you're actually doing a textual data collection, you'll have to know the local language as well as English. If you don't know the local language, it can actually become very difficult for you to understand this kind of textual data. Visual data, again, it can be in multi forms. It could actually be mapping. They could actually send you, where they are currently. That it could actually be like in some live location sharing. It could be photographs on different places. It could actually be forwarded YouTube videos. It could actually be their own, video that they actually make at that point of time at different places and everything else. So remember, this data collection also matters. So always remember, this is actually multimodal. So here's where you need to assemble the data properly and clearly code them and everything else. And you'll also have to do a lot of, let's say axial coding, and you'll also have to do, if you know how to do qualitative data analysis coding, it's always good to learn them, because it actually becomes very important. Intersectionality also matters out here a lot. Again, as mapping mechanisms, remember, we've already spoken about these two. I would just say, if you can, it's a very easy process would be the OpenStreetMaps. Do go to the OpenStreetMaps and then try understanding how these things actually work. And remember, once you actually collect this data for each of these individuals, let's say that there are around 20 key informants for you. Out of these 20 key informants, you start collecting data over a period of time, every month or once in every, at least speak about a time that you would actually be sending this mapping for them. And then like for each of these individuals, you'll actually end up sending the maps, actually do an interview with them after you send their monthly maps. And they'll actually look at that, and then they would, sometimes they might pay attention, sometimes they might actually tell you this yes and no. So it's always good to actually fix an interview after them, after monthly, sending them a monthly mapping, monthly, their own monthly personalized monthly maps, right? So it actually gives you a much better understanding if they did go to that area, if they did not go to that area, why is that they went to that place, why is that they did not go to that place. So you would actually, through these semi-structured interview processes and in-depth interview processes, you might actually understand how people actually move within the city. Now, doing this, and also just one last thing that you might want to remember, and this would be like in sense, that would be informants. It's not like a stable set of informants who actually come with you all through your process. There would be informants who actually on board, and then there would be informants who would actually off board. They might actually continue driving, they might not continue driving, right? Because the people are people, and for example, like the COVID-19, there were drivers, a lot of drivers who are key informants earlier who actually moved out of driving at that point of time. So you'll have to resample. So resampling technique is something that you might want to think about. Like you'll have to go get newer informants into play for you to understand how mobility mapping and everything else works. So remember, it's a longitudinal process. A lot of patience is required. People might onboard and offboard at any given point of time. And because it's, people can do it, it's a part of the ethics process as well. Finally, let's say, like, I just have two more slides. The insights, there are different insights that you can actually draw, right? When you actually do this kind of a mapping, right? Like, one is like, typically the easiest one would be a social resource mapping. You'd actually end up looking at publicly available resources. How do these people end up looking at the city? So they would actually tell you that the best of the toilets are available in this area at this specific time. So if you're going to be visiting these toilets, public toilets, you'll have to go to these public toilets before 11 o'clock in the morning. Don't go after that, because it actually becomes very bad. So, and then they would say, like, if you're actually going to go to these areas, it might be a good idea that you actually visit this let's say restaurant, or let's say this hotel or eatery at this point of time, because the cheapest food, the tastiest food is actually got there. So you can actually start mapping the entire city by the kind of social resources that are actually shared between these drivers alone. And you could also map the different kinds of suburbs, informal economic zones, and let's say gentrifications, the ghettos that they actually try not to operate. They try to operate violence and crime as well, because they actually also look at safety zones and everything else. Typically, the easiest way of mapping them would be like, they have green zones where they could actually travel. Without any hesitation. They would have amber zones where slight bit of hesitation is always there, red zones, social resource zones, safety zones, as well as informal economic or business zones. Very quickly, again, this is not an exact representation of how the mapping actually looks like, but then I can say very quickly, just for you to understand how these things operate, because there are different hues and colors. Again, as I told you, these are choropleth maps. These are not typically easy maps to actually do, but then just to represent how this actually works. For example, the red zone is where, I'm just going to give you an example from Chennai. There's this place called Kannagi Nagar in Chennai, which is located right next to a huge let's say, a highway called the IT highway, the Information Technology Highway, where lots of information technology parks and everything else are located in this highway. The government at some point of time decided that they needed to relocate different slums from different parts of the city, and then put them all together at this place called as Kannaginagar. So once this was actually located right next to a IT highway, right? So once this actually came into play there, what actually started happening was there was a lot of information exchange between these drivers at some point of time, not to visit this area alone. This area would alone be skipped, and then people would not pick up people from these areas. They would actually go to other areas and pick up people, but then they would not go ahead to these areas and pick up people. It was typically the form of ghettoization and everything else that was actually happening out here. Even though they could actually pay for it, it was not being done. They would actually go to this green zone, which is actually a typical college area, which was this college was actually taken over, which was right next to this Kannaginagar, but then it was actually divided by a small road, and this was actually taken over by typically upper middle class students from different parts of the country. It was actually seen as a viable economic zone. They would actually go to the viable economic zone, and they would actually go. The amber zone is where the amber zone is a zone in flux right now, which is like typically the IT employees have actually started coming into a place just outside Kannaginagar as well. But then like that's an amber zone. It's just outside the red zone. But then like people are not too sure if you would actually end up picking up a IT employee or a slum dweller from this area, right? So they would actually try and avoid these amber zones as much as possible. But then amber zones is typically considered still okay, but then like in the red zone, complete not okay, and the green zone was completely okay. Remember, all these things are located right next to each other, right? So where they call you actually becomes extremely important. And then there are cases where people actually tell you where they actually go to a place where they actually look at this person. If at all they feel that this person is not might have actually come from this slum or the red zone area, they would actually take their car off without even getting the person inside the car, and then the drive would actually be cancelled at some point of time. So the only thing is, like I said, when you actually look at it much more from a public policy perspective, it's nothing but reiteration of ghettos at some point of time. It actually, even though the government wanted to relocate them and then give them a much better life, it's actually they've actually gone ahead and constricted them into one single zone, and the zone is actually typically looked at like a red zone. And the elitist service and Uber and Ola, typically, even though they would not, they are typically considered a service to everyone, are typically becoming much more elitist in service, where they actually try and avoid zones and picking people up from these zones as well. So just to let you know, so if you want to use this creatively, there are lots of ways that you can actually do this. And if you actually want to use this much more of a collaborative process in just mapping different parts of the city and how a city develops over a period of time, you could also do this historically, because Google Maps actually has a historical record of how that specific area develops over a period of time as well. So you could actually do it from 2000, let's say 14, 2000, let's say 2004, 2010, etc., etc. And you could actually have a specific time limit on how you actually end up comparing this. So so again, it's only up to you to how you end up using this creatively and strategically. But then there's so much that you can actually do with a qualitative participatory mechanism of data collection as well, and you can actually map them onto mobility maps as well, right? Further advanced analysis is also something that you could do, but then I think there'll be too much to cover in just one session, but then I can send. So thank you so much. Any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Shriram, for your excellent presentation. And for sure, there are questions. I got one first, and
Sure.
I mean, studying data, digital platform in general, and of course, geolocated information sometimes is kind of hard, especially with a tool like Envivo you quoted, and I used to, especially, I mean, it's easy on some platforms such as Twitter. It's kind of harder in other platforms such as Facebook, as an example, or especially, let's say, the new social networks in general are very jealous about their API and their data. So sometimes it's very complicated to find a meaningful research path. So first part of the question is, do you have any suggestion about how to extract data on the new platforms, such as new platform, I mean by user adoption, such as TikTok, Instagram stories as another example, and of course even Facebook, which is still a great mine of information for digital researcher. And secondly, the thing of open data. It's an extreme urgent topic. And I think that probably, I mean, the challenge between public administration, public sphere, nation state versus commercial and global platform will literally be defined by the use of, let's say, proprietary data on one end, and on the other end by open accessible data. So I would like to have your take on these two issues.
So the first one, I think I think you actually hit the point, right? Like, instance, so the data collection through NVO earlier, NVO, even now it actually has something called the Encapture, right? Like, it actually collects social media data for you. But then the problem with Encapture is, like, instance, as Facebook keeps changing its algorithmic rules and, like, instance, aspects, like your Encapture has to also change accordingly, but then it doesn't. So it's very, if you're actually looking at an automated way of data collection, it can become slightly a bit of a difficulty. But then there are other tools, for example, like open or publicly available Facebook data can actually be collected by tools such as Octopus. There are lots of data collection tools, or there are lots of other API tools as well for data collection. But more importantly, but then these are like, you have to pay for them. It's not, of course, NVivo is also a paid data collection tool as well. So in 2014, 2015, I was able to get the entire Facebook profiles downloaded for most of my informants. But then, like, I can't do that right now because it's actually private data, and then they wouldn't allow you to do that. So what you'll have to do is, there's something called the Facebook Academic. So you'll have to apply to the Facebook Academic and let them know that you want to have this data, and then they will actually give you access to that data. So you can actually go ahead and collect it, which is also similar to what Twitter does. So I have several students of mine who actually apply through this Twitter Academic, and then they actually give you 1 month to collect all the data that you want. Sometimes if you tell them that you need extra time and everything else, they will actually give you, you could actually collect it. But I think close to around 2 weeks ago in the US, I think it was one of the courts in the US which actually said there was a big problem on ethics of data collection on Twitter, right? Because just because something is publicly available doesn't necessarily mean that you could actually go ahead and collect that kind of a data form. So in the US, I think the courts actually said very specifically, because these were these were computer science researchers who actually had this problem as well. Like, the courts actually said you can, if at all it's actually being made publicly available, you can actually go ahead and collect the data as well. But remember, one more thing that we might want to remember is there are, I think I'll probably share this YouTube channel with you. I think it's actually from University of New South Wales. They're actually looking at, and there's a huge Google Doc which actually has creative processes of data collection from different social media. For example, like TikTok, from Instagram and Instagram Reels, as well as from TikTok was actually banned in India, but then, like, instance, from different let's say social media platforms. I think they also have a YouTube channel which is actually called Creative Data Collection or something like that. It's actually from University of New South Wales, and I think it's actually run by Deborah Lupton, who actually is a professor of digital sociology, and she actually works a lot on digital health. They also have, during COVID, they actually released a huge document of open sources, open resources that you can actually use to go ahead and collect, different forms of data. So, but then for qualitative, but for quantitative, there are ways that you can actually use API tools and everything else to actually go ahead and collect data. Like, I don't think they actually, to be honest, I don't think they really respect these data collection rules and everything else, but you could actually end up collecting that data. But more importantly, I think your second question, but more importantly, just to let you also know, like, right now, Twitter Academic operates right now. But then once Elon Musk takes over Twitter, that might also change, because Twitter is going to go into becoming a private platform. It might not be public anymore. It's not a publicly listed company once Elon Musk takes it over. So it might actually become a private company. It's not a private platform, but it might actually become a private company. And then it only depends on them to give you data or not to give you data. So that might be a very different problem that we might actually end up facing. But on data repurposing, the open data, I think there's a lot of let's say, there's a lot of dialogue that's actually going on, at least at different places in the US and Canada, I guess, like, where they also speak about this much more from a public policy point of view as well, where they actually end up speaking about big data, much more specific to data repurposing. So data repurposing is something where they actually end up speaking about, let's say, if at all we abstract data and everything else, can actually data be repurposed for, as an open data source, which can actually be used by the governments as well as, like, typically the, data enthusiasts all around the world in actually helping the society in a much better way than, for example, I think an example that was given was, I think, the real estate firm called Zillow, which actually had several thousands of reviews and everything else. If at all they could actually be, if at all they could actually be abstracted and anonymized, could that data actually become much more of an open data that's actually publicly available? And can the data be repurposed to actually study housing markets in the US and predict if at all the world is actually going to undergo another huge, let's say, crisis, economic crisis or whatever it is, right? Again, so, private firms, private companies, and let's say the public firms have actually started talking about it. But then, again, open data actually means different things to different people. So again, what kind of, this is something that's actually happening with respect to data repurposing. Now, the other form of open data that we're also talking about is, like, typically the government data and everything else. And even that, again, I think there was also a dialogue on what is visible and what is invisible with respect to open data forms. Now, what kind of open data we are talking about is also another important thing that actually comes into play. But let's say, like, in sense, if we're actually talking about open street maps and things like that, right? Like, for example, that is open data. Typically, even, for example, the reason I spoke about the visibility and the invisibility angle is that even though people actually end up saying that Google Maps is actually completely open data and their developer zones and everything else would actually tell you, it is not typically open data, because you could always have advertisers. The same data mapping is actually used by Google to actually give advertisers a completely different perspective of what areas would buy what and everything else, typically from a marketing perspective. While the OpenStreetMaps is a typical open data platform where you could actually use that kind of data for any purposes that you might actually require. So again, when people say, like, let's say, the kind of open data that we're talking about, it could actually have multiple dimensions as well. But then data repurposing and making a company, let's say, corporate data available to the entire world through abstraction and through anonymization of data forms is also something that people are talking about. But having said that, with the GDPR and the California data protection law and everything else that's actually come into play right now, it's actually going to be, I guess it's actually going to be slightly more difficult in in accessing certain kinds of open data as well. I think there are going to be rules and regulations that are going to be put into play on, right to forget is something that, things are also coming up. These kinds of things are also coming up. So it's, so just to let you know, it's actually much more complicated than a simple yes or no.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that in a society that which basically record everything, every behavior, every interaction, every conversation, the right to forget will become for sure the new dimension of the privacy, as well as, like the separations, the split between public life and private life in your home during the classical modernity was the classical physical separation, which we cannot have in a digital society. Of course, it would be definitely the right to forget, the ultimate form of privacy we can claim in the, of course, unbalance of power we have between human people and platforms and algorithms.
Exactly. I completely yeah.
Thank you very much, Shriram. And there are any other questions from the floor? Okay, I have to say that, Shriram, I really appreciate your thought-provoking presentation. I really wish to have more interaction with you, be in touch for the development of your research, as well as our research. Me and Gillette definitely will come back to you for discussing eventual opportunity of mutual research, publication, and enlarging this research group we are building and structuring on a global scale. So, by the way, thank you very much, Shriram. I take the occasion also for wrapping the things up about our summer school doing this long, dense, challenging, but also amazing week we spent together. I think that this has been, or at least to my end, and I can think I'm talking also on behalf of Laura and Gillette, which unfortunately couldn't be here with us, but she strongly apologized for that. It has been literally food for thought. Every presentation, every discussion, every interaction has literally been dense of stimuli and could literally spring on other different stream of research, analysis, publication, and everything. It has been definitely a dense week of activity. Unfortunately, or luckily, we guess have to say, we couldn't share the physical presence together, but on the other hand, we also have taken the advantage of joining together from different parts of the world, different interdisciplinary scholars from everywhere on earth, I have to say, because we had scholars from Netherlands, Northern Europe, India, of course, US, East Coast, US, West Coast, so basically Italy, and I mean, and even students from Germany, Georgia, India, Italy, and so on and so forth. So we are literally delighted about how we all together, us as organizer and you as contributors and participators, of course, of building such an amazing and challenging environment for increasing knowledge on such an urgent topic as it is platformization, digitalization, and all the challenges that are coming together in the hybrid and digital space. Several topics have been developed during this week. Some common elements are found, like the idea, of course, of platformization, which was the main frame, the main theme of the whole summer school, but also the idea of regulation, GDPR, California law, and the whole issue of regulating platform, data protection, guarantee for citizen and user. All these are elements that needs to be further explored, debated, and of course, let's say, criticized and built upon stronger basis, as well as, of course, the relationship between citizen and public administration under the lens of the socio-technical system and under the dimension of a human-driven technology more than a platform or algorithm-driven technology. Without forgetting, of course, the topic of consumption and way more of presumption that basically fuels the whole idea of platformization that has been brilliantly discussed yesterday by our colleague, I mean, by me, and of course by, oh gosh, I'm missing his name, Martin Kenny. And lastly, the idea of the digitalization of money, which is talking about cryptocurrency, but not just about crypto and NFT, the whole process of money disappearing from our hands and being embedded into our device or plastic. I mean, even plastic looks like being a pretty outdated example of money nowadays, because mostly everything goes through our screens, watches, and smart devices in general. And this is definitely an ultimate transformation in the socio-technical relationship we have with currency and the way we do transfer money. And I wish to quote Schumpeter when he used it to discuss about how cash has been the symbol of modernity, because it was anonymous and it was transferable from people to people. Nowadays, the process of transferring value in general is a process that is platform controlled, digital trackable, and the result of an interaction of not just sharing the value of the currency in general or paying the price for a service or good, but more than that, it's the transfer of data and the sharing of computational power between two or more different subjects. This is definitely a game changer in the logic and in the structure, I have to say, of the subject involved in the process of value transfer. And so this is probably, let's say, the beginning of a new process and a new line of project for a new summer school and new conference, International Emerging Platform Society Summer School and Conference 2.0, or whatever we want to call it. But for sure, we would like to be in touch with every one of you and upgrade our thought, upgrade and enlarge the number of scholar and PhD student involved in our researchers, and hopefully having some of you on the other end of the screen at the moment, but hopefully on the other end of the desk, and having you teaching or defending and explaining your project of research to other international students. So thank you, everybody. I'm really proud about this path we have done together, but we will pursue our path online on our website and hopefully also in person in Italy, India, or wherever in the world. Stay safe and be in touch. See you then. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.